Just today, actually a few minutes ago, I saw the news that the Russian army has installed half a dozen of anti-aircraft batteries within the perimeter of the city of Moscow. They're very, very much concerned about Putin's being intact. This war hangs on one person. It's Putin's war. The moment he's gone, the war and the carnage and the threat of nuclear confrontation would immediately go away.
Alex Goldfarb is joining us to talk about a few things: Ukraine, Russia, the United States, and himself. Alex, you were very busy engaging in some activities regarding Russian propaganda well before this new phase of the war in Ukraine began. And I wanted to circle back with you to check in to see where you were with that, because you were involved in the courts with a number of activities that the Russian government was engaged in. Where does that stand, and how did that end up, or is it finished yet?
Yes, we're still in litigation against the main news channel of the Russian TV called Channel 1 Russia, where I'm suing them in the federal court in New York for defamation, for them calling me the murderer of Alexander Litvinenko. To remind you, this is the Russian defector, dissident, who was poisoned in London 16 years ago, now or 17 years ago, with radioactive polonium. So they had a program a couple of years ago on Russian TV accusing me of being his murderer, so I'm suing them. It's still in the courts. Courts work slowly. So far, we've been winning every motion, but after the war has started in Ukraine, and Channel 1, along with other Russian outlets, have been expelled from the United States and Western Europe. It's mostly, this case is mostly of an academic interest, because they have no presence in the West, so there'll be no way to enforce this.
Well, just for the audience that's new, we want to tell them to be clear about this allegation that you were the murderer of Alexander Litvinenko. It was quite the opposite. He was a very good friend of yours. Is that not correct?
Yes, he was a good friend of me. We worked together. I helped him write his books, and actually I helped him to arrive in the UK in 2000, which is 23 years ago, when he fled from Russia. And since he was killed, which happened in 2006, from that moment, Russian propaganda and Russian state-controlled TV channels started pushing an alternative narrative of that story. One narrative was, of course, the truth that has been eventually established by British courts, that Litvinenko was poisoned by two agents of the Russian secret services who brought polonium to London. And the alternative relative, which has been pushed, as I said, from day one, is that Litvinenko was poisoned by Western security services and intelligence services, particularly the CIA and the British service, in order to tarnish Russia and to prevent Litvinenko from coming back, and so on. So they've been pushing it all along, and every time this issue came up in the news, for example, after there was a poisoning attack of Sergey Skripal in Salisbury in 2018 with something called Novichok, another nerve agent. There was a And they were returning to this story on Russian propaganda and reviving the Litvinenko case. So that's what happened. And so it was not surprising at all. But once this happened with regard to accusing me, and I realized that I could sue them together with Marina Litvinenko, the widow, in a Western court. We filed a lawsuit. I filed a lawsuit in the US, and we're still there litigating.
So, Alex, the situation you mentioned regarding Sergey Skripal, who was poisoned 2017, I believe, along with his daughter in the UK. It was around that time that I think you told us in an interview that we posted and published on the Target USA podcast that you actually had been contacted by federal authorities in the US to check on you to see how you were doing, because they were concerned at that time, based on what had taken place with Skripal, that perhaps they might try things like that here in the US. Recently, several sources who are either defectors from Russia or Russians living in the US who have, in one way or another, supposedly helped the US government, have expressed concern that Russia might again be at this plan to go after Russians living in abroad and in the US, and maybe after them to harm them. Have you seen anything or heard anything from any authorities regarding your own personal safety?
No. There was nothing of the kind since that visit in 2018. And I should say that most of the Russian expats, politically active expats who are campaigning against Putin and his war in Ukraine, have now been located in Europe, where they set up, radio stations and podcasts and YouTube channels from places like Latvia and Ukraine and Germany and France. So most of this activity in the expat community has been in Europe. So I would say that I'm not, I shouldn't be the prime target.
Well, let me ask you this question. Why is most of this activity taking place in Europe? We know, at least I do, I think you do too, that there are a number of key Russians who have helped the U.S. government living in the U.S.
Well, at the moment, the major focus is on information war and propaganda war. And in order to be effective in, in their activities against the Putin's regime, it's no longer, as far as I understand, the spying business, the security business. It's mostly information business. So there have been some investment, I believe, and a major TV channel has been set up in Latvia. Even the organizations such as the Voice of America are operating now together in partnership with Russian expats, and they have outlets in Europe. So it's mostly in Europe, simply because the flight of talent from Russia, they say that about 1 million people has left since the war started last February. So, and these are the best people in journalism and in arts. They're all settled in the periphery of Russia. So there is a concentration of talent and money. So I would say that the activity is mostly centered in the periphery of Russia.
All right. To Russia, the leader of Russia, Vladimir Putin. I've heard, I'm sure you've heard, I think we've actually talked about this before. There is widespread speculation at best, I guess, that Vladimir Putin is ill. And some people that I've spoken to in the last few days, weeks, have suggested that he may be more ill than people here in the West know. What have you heard?
Well, to me, it's mostly speculation. The only official source that really subscribed to this notion is a couple of officials from the government of Ukraine who are at war with Russia, of course, and it's understandable that they would use this as part of their information war. But watching Putin on the TV screen, I see and reading the mainstream media, which is actually very well informed, I don't see any reasons to believe that Putin is ill. That said, I would say that Putin is very much concerned about his health and his safety and his well-being. For example, everybody have seen the pictures of Putin meeting people during the COVID pandemic, where he was sitting at the other end of the room from everybody else. And we know for a fact that any visitor, including foreign heads of state who come to see Putin, they must submit 2 recent PCR tests to make sure that they are not carrying any virus. And just today, actually a few minutes ago, I saw the news that the Russian army has installed half a dozen of anti-aircraft batteries within the perimeter of the city of Moscow. So they're very, very much concerned about Putin's being intact, particularly because this war hangs on one person. It's Putin's war. The moment he's gone, the war and the carnage and the threat of nuclear confrontation would immediately go away. And so he is very, very much concerned about being safe and there.
Well, that's very interesting. About the missile batteries being posted around the city of Moscow. Do you think that has anything to do with what some of the intelligence people are saying, is that Moscow is planning a long-term war? They're expecting to be attacked. Is that it?
Well, Moscow, it's, I think we could take it for a fact that Moscow is preparing to a major offensive. They're mobilizing hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and they are beefing up their technological park. And generally speaking, Putin has no option other than some sort of a win, because if he loses this war, and by losing, I mean the terms of the Ukrainians, that the Russian army leaves the territory of Ukraine, if that happens, Putin is finished. He would probably not survive that. Not that he would resign, but that he might be deposed, because everybody in Russia understands that this is his war, this is his decision, and that the moment he is gone, there will be a way to open negotiations with the West about easing the sanctions and easing the economic pressure on Russia. So even the establishment, the Putin's immediate circle, must be hoping that somehow Putin would go, and that's the most, in my view, it's the most likely good scenario, that Putin loses the war and someone will remove him in Russia. Or alternatively, as their anti-aircraft activity in the center of Moscow, actually, we've seen today on the web photographs of this serious anti-aircraft batteries being installed in the parks surrounding Moscow, in the suburbs, actually. So that may be another indication that Putin understands very well that he personally is the make or break factor in this war.
That is very interesting once again. Alex Goldfarb. Alex, is there anything I haven't asked you about today that you think is important as we take a look at this situation in Ukraine and this war that Russia's leading and Vladimir Putin is pushing? Is there anything I haven't asked you about that you think is important?
I would say that the question that concerns me lately is what will happen after the war. Assuming that Ukraine wins, that means that Ukraine is able to push the Russians out of their territory. And this is not a trivial question. If we remember World War II, well, I would say that neither Ukraine nor Ukrainian Western allies are planning or thinking about marching on Moscow and taking Kremlin by storm, as they did with Hitler at the end of World War II. Most likely they will stop at the borders. So imagine the Allies stopped at the German borders in 1944. And on top of that, imagine if Hitler had the atomic weapons at that point. It means that the war will probably stop at that point. So what we'll have Putin still in Moscow, still in his bunker, armed with nuclear arms. And what next? How do you make sure that this regime is somehow dismantled or removed? Obviously, it can happen only as the result of some sort of a coup or a revolution. So most likely we will see extended economic pressure and political pressure, so-called I would call it the doctrine of containment 2, and in the hope that the regime will change. And what next? As we remember, when the Allies occupied Germany, they managed the government there for a good part of the decade that followed the occupation. And they conducted the massive denazification, and they re-educated, they control the media, they control the culture, and so on. I was thinking about what our policymakers were planning for the post-war period, how they see the end of the, not the end of the war militarily, but how they see the end and dismantling of the Putin regime, which, if it survives, will pose a permanent threat to the West with their weapons and so on. So that's the interesting question to me.
Well, that is a very concerning development and thought, because most folks, yes, have thought maybe peripherally about what happens after this war is over, but many of us just are so focused on what's going on day to day. We really haven't thought much about what happens after this war, but that is a very sobering point that you bring up, that we need to think about that. And maybe we'll continue that conversation on our next interview. But Alex, thank you again. Hopefully we will talk to you soon.
You're welcome, JJ. Anytime. Bye-bye.